Good morning to all. Myself Prabir Kumar Swami, lecturer in mechanical, Bose Kotak. Previously, we will study different types of what is milling, different types of milling methods, and different types of milling machines. Then we will start different types of milling machine operations. Today we will discuss what are the different types of milling operations, means what are the operations that could be performed on the milling machine. In milling machines, those operations we can perform these milling machines. Today we will discuss that. First one is milling machines operations. Following are the different types of operations performed on milling machines. First is plain milling machine, then face milling machines, side milling machines, straddle milling machines, angular milling machines, milling operations, gang milling operations, power milling operations, profile milling operations, end milling operations, saw milling operations, milling QA, groove and short, gear milling, helical milling, cam milling and thread milling. Today we will discuss all these milling operations. Then we will see one by one. First is plain milling operations. What do you mean by plain milling operations? Plain milling operations means if we will produce a plain surfaces, parallel to the milling cutter axis, that is called plain milling operations. Means if we will produce the plain surfaces on a workpiece that is parallel to this plane surfaces is parallel to the axis of the milling cutter, that is called plain milling operations. This is workpiece, this is the this is arbor which holds this peripheral cutter, this is the peripheral cutter, this is peripheral cutter having teeth, these peripheral cutters having teeth on the periphery of cutter. That is, if this is a cutter, this is arbor, and this is the teeth, this is the peripheral cutter. When these peripheral cutters are rotated against the workpiece or along the workpiece, these flat surfaces are produced. This flat surface is called plain milling, and if in plain milling, if peripheral cutter is used, this is called plain milling, and if we use peripheral cutter, if we use face cutter, this is called face milling. Means if in plain milling, what do you mean by plain milling? If we will produce a flat surfaces which is parallel to the axis of the cutter, this is called plain milling. That is, in plain milling we use peripheral cutter. Means peripheral cutter means those cutters having teeth on the periphery of the teeth are placed on the periphery. This peripheral cutter is used for plain milling. Second one is face milling. Then the plain milling is the most common types of milling machines operations. Plain milling is performed to produce a plain flat horizontal surfaces parallel to the axis of rotation of plain milling machine. Means in plain milling machines we will produce a plain surfaces which is parallel to the axis of rotation of plain milling cutter. The operation is also known as slam milling. Means we can tell plain milling as slam milling. To perform the operations, the work and the cutter are secured properly on the machines. The depth of cut is set by rotating the vertical feed screw of the table, and the machine is started after selecting the right speed and feed. This is peripheral cutter. Then peripheral milling or a plane milling. This is the slam milling, face milling. This one is face milling. What is face milling? Here is also we have to produce a plane flat surfaces. Here also we have to produce a plane flat surfaces, but these flat surfaces should be perpendicular to the axis of rotation of the cutter. If these flat surfaces is perpendicular to the axis of the axis of the cutter rotation or axis of the cutter, this is called, means this plane surface to be produced, plane surface to be produced should be perpendicular to the cutter axis, should be perpendicular to the cutter axis, is called face milling. In face milling we use face cutter. In face milling we use face cutter. In face milling we use face cutter. What is face cutter? Means if this is the cutter, in cutter face means the end face of the cutter carry different number of teeth. End face of the cutter carry number of teeth. Means if this is the cutter and this surface, if this is a cutter, these surfaces carry number of teeth. This cutter is called face cutter, and if we use face cutter to produce flat surfaces, this is called face milling. So this is the cutter, number of teeth on the end face, and this is the workpiece. Workpiece produced is workpiece produced. This is the flat surfaces, and these flat surfaces is perpendicular to this cutter axis. This workpiece is perpendicular to this cutter axis. So this is called face milling operations. Then we will see the face milling is the simplest milling machines operations. These operations is performed by a face milling cutter rotated about an axis perpendicular to the work surface. The operation is carried in plane milling, and the cutter is mounted on a stub arbor to design a flat surfaces. The depth of cut is adjusted by rotating the cross feed screw to the table. Then next operation is side milling. Side milling means on the workpiece a vertical flat surface. On the side of a workpiece we should on the vertical sides of a workpiece we should, if we produce a vertical surfaces by using a side milling cutter, this is called side milling. By using a side milling cutter means if this is a workpiece and this is the cutter, this is the cutter. On cutter, this surface has this surface should have teeth and periphery. Means side milling cutter has teeth. Side milling cutter has teeth both on periphery, and side, of cutter. Means if we use a side milling cutter, that cutter, what do you mean by side milling cutter? And side milling cutter contains teeth both on periphery and also on the side of the cutter, if we use side milling cutter to produce a flat vertical surfaces on a workpiece, this is called side milling. The side milling is the operations of producing a flat vertical surfaces on the side of a workpiece by using a side milling cutter. The depth of cut is set by rotating the vertical feed screw of the table. Then next is straddle milling. What do you mean by straddle milling? What do you mean by straddle milling? If we use a vertical surfaces on both sides of the workpiece simultaneously, if we produce vertical surfaces on both sides of the workpiece simultaneously by side milling cutter, that is called straddle milling. And these both side milling cutters are placed in the arbor and separated by spacers, so that these side milling cutters should not contact to each other. That's why spacers is provided to keep the distance fixed between this cutter and this cutter. And this is one side milling cutter and this is one side milling cutter. Side milling cutter, if produced both the vertical surfaces on the both sides of the workpiece simultaneously, that is called straddle milling. What is straddle milling? Then the straddle milling is the operation. Straddle milling is the operations of producing a flat vertical surfaces on both sides of workpiece by using two side milling cutter mounted on the same arbor. Means here arbor is used to hold the cutter. Distance between these two cutters are adjusted by using a suitable element, that is called spacers or collars. Then angular milling. Angular milling means if we have to produce an angular surfaces, on the workpiece, we have to use angular milling operations. We have to perform angular milling surfaces. One of the angular milling surfaces is vice. One of the angular milling means vice is produced by this is the vice face. If this surface should be produced, it can be produced by angular milling operations. Angular milling operations. Angular milling is the operations of producing an angular surfaces on a workpiece other than at right angles of the axis of the milling machine spindle. The angular group may be single or double angle, means and double angle and may be of varying included angle according to the type and contour of the angular cutter used. Means here tell the angular surface may be single or double. This, if we will produce these types of surfaces, this is one angle and this is one angle. So this is the double angular surfaces and this is the form angle. This form angle can be varied to produce different angular surfaces. This one is form angle. Form angle. This one is form angle. If we will vary these form angles, then we can produce the different types of angular surfaces. Then next operations is gang milling. What do you mean by gang milling? If number of cutters are used, if there are number of cutters on the arbor to produce different surfaces at a time, this is called gang milling machines. To produce different surfaces at a time. This is the image of gang milling operations. Means here is the one cutter, here is the one cutter, and here is the one cutter. This is side and face milling cutter. This is arbor is used to hold these three cutters, and in between these spacers are used. This is the spacer or collar. to place the cutter in positions. This is the gang milling operation, this is workpiece, and here the three different operations are performed. The gang milling is the operations of machining several surfaces of a workpiece simultaneously by feeding the table against a number of cutters used in the arbor or held in the arbor having the same or different diameters mounted on the arbor of the machines. The method saves much of machining time and is widely used in repetitive work. Here the gang milling operations saves more times because generally in manufacturing, if we will produce in manufacturing, if we will produce this surface, again another surfaces, again another surfaces, then one by one operations should be performed, one by one in sequence, one by one in sequence, one by one in sequence. Sequentially manufacturing process takes place, but in gang milling machine is called at a time both the surfaces produced simultaneously. This will save much more times. Then form milling. The next operations is form milling. This is the diagram of form milling operations. The form milling is the operations of producing the irregular contour. Irregular contour by using irregular contour means irregular forms. Irregular contour. Irregular contour means irregular forms. Irregular shape. Irregular shape. Irregular contour or irregular shape by using form cutters means the surface which is to be produced, means the surface which is to be produced should have the opposite, should have the opposite or matching pair of the other, should have the matching pair, means if we will produce, means if you will produce this, means milling cutter should be like this, means the surface which is to be produced should have opposite shape, opposite or should have matching surfaces of the cutter, means workpiece and cutter surfaces both are matching. In this way we can produce different irregular shape of the different irregular shape on the workpiece. This is called form milling. The form milling is the operations of producing the irregular shapes by using form cutters. The irregular shape may be convex, concave or any of the other shape. After machining, the formed surfaces is inspected by template gauge. This is the form milling. This one is the form milling, and next is profile milling. What is profile milling? Now the profile milling is the operations of a reproduction and outline of a template or a complex shape of a master dies on a workpiece. Different cutters are used for profile milling, and end mill is one of the widely used milling cutters in the profile milling work. Means in profile milling, end milling is used. In profile milling, the end milling is used to produce different profiles. Then next is end milling cutter. The next is end milling. What do you mean by end milling? Now to produce flat surfaces, to produce a flat surfaces on any plane, in flat plane, flat in horizontal plane or vertical plane or angular plane, end milling is used. End milling is used to produce these flat surfaces, and end milling combines peripheral milling, cutter. End milling combines both the operations, peripheral milling and face milling. Means end milling combines both. End milling combines both. End milling combines both, that is peripheral cutter, peripheral cutter, and second is peripheral cutter, second is face cutter, face milling cutter. face peripheral cutter and face milling cutter. If we combine these two, then we will find end milling cutter. In end milling cutters, the the teeth are present both on the end face and periphery. In end milling cutters, the teeth is present on both on the periphery and also on the end face. That's why we can produce flat surfaces on horizontal surfaces or vertical surfaces. Next, this is the end milling is the operations of producing a flat surfaces which may be vertical, horizontal or at an angle in reference to the table surfaces. Means we can produce flat surfaces in horizontal plane, vertical plane or any angular plane. The cutter used is an end mill. The end milling cutters are also used for the production of slot, grooves or Q edge. A vertical milling machine is more suitable for end milling operations. Means vertical milling machines is best suitable for end milling operations. Means in vertical milling machines, maximum time end milling cutter is used. Then next is saw milling cutter. Then next is saw milling cutter. This is the examples. This is the diagram of saw milling. Saw milling is the operations of producing narrow slots or grooves on a workpiece. Means saw milling produces narrow grooves or slots on producing narrow slots or grooves on a workpiece by using a saw milling cutter. Means by using saw milling cutter we can produce a narrow slots or grooves on a workpiece. The saw milling also performs complete parting of operations. The cutter and the workpiece are set in a manner so that cutter is directly placed over one of the T slots of the table. This is overall the operations that could be produced, that can be performed on a milling machines. These are the different operations that can be performed on a milling machines. Next, we will show next. Next means indexing head. Then next we will study indexing. First we will study what is indexing. What is indexing? Indexing method is used to